Right, my name's James and I paint miniatures. This is Spoon 37 Minis. Okay, so this is What's on the Bench, episode 10. Last episode saw the first quite generous layer highlight of army painted tan flesh. This time we're going to do a much more selective coat in the same colour, so it is the second layer highlight of the same colour. This will later be followed by highlights in Barbarian Flesh, which is a slightly lighter flesh colour. Now we're just starting off with tan flesh on the shotgun guy, I suppose you call him, from the gang. It's exactly the same pattern as before, so we're starting with the top of the head and we're doing, the features of the face, the cheeks, the ears, the neck, etc. before moving on to the areas around the neck and then the arms and so on. Just as we did before, the difference here is we're doing a much more selective highlight, so we're not covering the whole area, we're covering part of it so as to continue highlighting a little further, but then also leaving some of the previous highlight behind so it will be slightly darker. If we do the highlights in this pattern, it will lead to a gradual build-up of colour, which is what you're ideally looking for, preferably not with hundreds and hundreds of layers, but if you do 2 or 3 thin layers of highlighting, you should get that nice gradual build-up of highlight that you're looking for. Now, just as before, I'm painting along these relatively thin lines with a fine brush. This is slightly finer than I used last time. I believe last time I was using the Games Workshop S layer brush. This is a sort of generic cheap brush which describes itself, or its brush size rather, as 20/0. I'm not sure what that means, because that sounds like it would be absolutely microscopic, whereas this, if I compare it to other brush manufacturers that I have, seems to be similar to a 00 size. So it's quite a fine tipped brush, but it's nothing fancy in the world of brushes. Now, just while we're on the subject of paintbrushes, I know there are lots of pro painters who make a big fuss about having brush manufacturer X or Y, they want you to have these very fine Kolinsky sable brushes or what have you. For something like this, a cheap synthetic brush is perfectly fine as long as it comes to a nice fine tip. You may find that this wears out slightly quicker than a really nice high-end brush, but it'll also be so much cheaper it may actually be worth it for most people. I certainly I've never had any objections to using a cheaper brush as long as it'll get the job done. I'm not worried what the name says on the handle. So we're painting along the lines of each muscle as before. The idea is to come up with lines going in the direction they would on the muscles naturally as far as possible. The difference is using a finer brush and doing a second layer highlight. The lines need to be thinner and hit much less area, so you'd just be hitting, say, the middle of the shoulder and then a little bit on the front shoulder and rear shoulder, and just having this relatively fine highlight compared to last time, covering a lot less area so as to build it up. Now, because we are being a little bit more selective with this, I am actually getting through the highlighting a little bit faster, so to that end I will be showing you this stage on 2 of the Goliath models as I did last time, just so that you get the idea rather than feeling that I've skipped ahead a little too quickly. Now the other thing about using a fine tip brush is it does allow you to poke it into areas like under the shoulder pad here and at the top of the elbow that might have been difficult with a larger brush where it holds more paint and you have to go to the palette less often, but you wouldn't have necessarily got into some of these tiny little gaps. So do choose your brushes accordingly. Generally they get finer as you go along with your layer highlights. Now we're just starting to highlight the hands and the fingers. This again is fairly selective, focusing on just the upper edges of the hand, the upper edges of the fingers, and of course focusing on areas like the knuckles and the lines that stand up on the back of the hand as he's gripping the handle of the shotgun. I'll do the same on the other hand, but the idea is just to catch slightly less area than you would before. Now it's okay if you end up making the hands a little lighter than the surrounding area. The poses that these guys are in, it would be reasonable if they were, you know, gripping the gun or the axe or whatever it is quite hard. So it's okay if they have, like, you know, the proverbial white knuckles, as long as, you know, you've got it highlighted on every single joint, every single finger, etc. It's going to still look correct. Now I did get through these fingers a little quickly, which was probably a mistake, because when I looked at this afterwards I found I actually had some minor errors to fix, so bear that in mind. I did scoot through that a little bit quickly. Now, moving on to the Goliath gang leader. Same again really, starting with the top of the head and face. Just getting through it a little quicker as I'm painting slightly less area compared to last time, and this is the nature of layer highlights. They get faster and faster as you go along because you're painting less and less area. You just have to be a little more careful because you need to also be painting a smaller area, not just going faster for the sake of it. Now the lines around his face are particularly thin, and of course he's got this annoying cigar sticking out, and then right by that there's this sort of raised bit of his chest armour, so it does make it difficult to get in and do all the lines. So just take your time, be careful, make sure to get in from the side so you can paint around the mouth and the chin and so on, and you'll get through the highlights just fine. Now you can see here I'm just having to turn him upside down to get at the sort of chin on the one side, and then flip him over and do the chin on the other side, which is a bit easier to get to. And then it's moving on to painting the tops of the neck, which is a little bit easier to get to because that's a little bit more exposed. So you can just highlight the upper edges of the lines on the neck, although in this case it's more like about halfway along them, and then the creases on the back of the neck as well, which you can only mainly see from the one side, but highlight them everywhere you can reasonably reach. Once you've got the areas around the face and the neck done, you can move on as before to the area around the traps, the chest, and then of course we'll move on to the arms. Okay, so moving on to the outer areas, the back, the shoulders, the arms, that sort of thing. All we're trying to do is put a thin line on these areas, anywhere where I feel the light would catch it, or the peak of the muscle would actually be showing up. So if a muscle seems to be flexed, the absolute middle of it, or if it's just catching light, the sort of upper edge of it, and just trying to put a bit of highlight on there. I'm also doing the area of the sort of abs, which are kind of hidden, and then the kind of obliques and side of the lats. Just again, anywhere where it's going to catch the light, and I'm trying to paint in lines along the lines that they would be in the actual muscle, although I'm pretty sure it's too small to show, but I'm just keeping that in mind whilst I'm painting. Now moving on to the hands, as before, focusing on the upper edge, and then the upper edge of each finger, the knuckle joints themselves, and then because they're actually visible on this one, the fingertips as well also want highlighting. Some of this will be covered by highlighting in the lighter colour later on, but you should still do this stage so that there's a gradual fade from the darker to the lighter colour. I'm having to be careful around this area of kind of the side of the chest, the obliques, the area under the arm where there are muscular details showing. Even if on the overall model they're not going to be standout areas, you still want to try and get a little bit of highlighting on them if you can. So here, the underside of the tricep and the bicep on the inside of the arm, the underarm area, still need a little bit of highlighting to catch them, so I'm having to tilt the holder over. I hope you can see that. So I'm just catching those muscles and then going back to the bits that show rather better after that. Once that's done, we can move on to the hand as per the other side, focusing on the upper edge, the knuckles, which I sort of cheat and do in a line, and possibly the raised lines on the back of the hand as he grips the handle. I didn't actually do the area under the sort of finger guard on the gun. I just did the fingers on both sides, and I actually can't see the fingers like base colour anyway, so I don't think it'll matter too much, just as long as you catch the knuckles, all of the joints and the upper edges, that should be alright. Now, same again, only this time we're going to use a lighter colour. We're going to use something called Barbarian Flesh from the Army Painter. So I've already given it a little bit of shake, and I'm tipping it out onto the palette so that it can be watered down and used as a further highlight colour. Please note that in between shooting the footage for the previous colour and this colour, the models have actually had several hours to dry. You don't have to leave them for 8 or 9 hours, but in my case I happen to have done so because I fit this hobby time in whenever I can, so I happen to be able to paint a bit later on, so this has had quite a long time to dry. Now, you may have noticed as I dragged the paintbrush through the paint, I was actually rolling it as I did so to encourage the bristles to reach a point on this brush. This brush, incidentally, is a Ghost Brush 00 size, so similar in size to the previous brush I was using, but despite what I said earlier, this is actually a higher quality brush and tends to more consistently come to a fine point, making this step a lot easier. So what we're doing here is just focusing on the real peaks, the tips of the eyebrows, the tip of the nose, the very uppermost part of the head, just anywhere that would really catch the light and needs a highlight. There's also areas such as the cheeks, for example, where I'm probably going to leave it at the level of the previous highlight and not highlight it any further. That way you get different parts of the face are naturally more or less highlighted than others, and it gives you a more natural look. Despite painting less area, you'll notice I'm taking my time to be very careful and just catch the tops of the ears, the uppermost lines, thin lines on the face. I just noticed I'm correcting an error there. I got paint inside the ear and I've just put water on the brush and got rid of it, and I'll do that again. That is something I was hoping to catch on film, by the way, but it doesn't usually happen when I'm thinking about recording a mistake, so I happen to get lucky here. Anyway, I'm just doing the lines on the face very carefully. I'll also follow that up with the very tops of the lines on the neck and just a spot on each of the wrinkles on the neck, and so on, just to be very selective and catch just the sort of peak highlights that we want, nothing more. Now the trick here, and one of the reasons why we're using such a fine brush to do this, is that you don't want to cover up the highlights that we've just done. You actually just want to highlight the very, very peak and leave the other levels of highlight. So ideally you'd have base colour, layer 1, layer 2 and layer 3, possibly layer 4 and 5 if you're going to go that far. So you do need to leave some of the previous layer showing. If you should go over one of the previous layers a bit too much, don't worry about it. It's very easy to go back in and fix. Just when it's dry, get some of the previous highlight colour, or if you've gone over the base colour, get some of that and just paint over anywhere that looks like it's been highlighted too much and needs that subtle graduation, and just you can build it back up even if you've made quite a significant mistake. So don't worry about it too much, just realise that it is correctable and it's not that difficult to correct. Now again, we're just catching the tops of the muscles, so this isn't a very significant highlight. I'm doing quite a bit on the shoulders, but it is still very thin lines right towards the top, anywhere where I feel the light would catch it, or it would naturally have, the muscles flexing close to the skin. Then obviously it's going to have to be a bit more highlighted. Other areas, it's just wherever I feel it would catch the light, or whatever I feel would look correct. Now with these lines on the back, it's very important to do very thin painted lines and just catch only the upper areas or anywhere that you feel would be properly illuminated. Anything else is going to look a bit strange, like as if it's been lit from beneath or from the side, which is fine if there is supposed to be a light source on, say, the base or something, that's fine, but I'm assuming, like with most models, that the light is going to be coming vaguely from above, proceeding on that basis. Moving on to the hands, same as before, but this is even more selective, so we're being very careful about the knuckles and the joints, trying to line the tops of the fingers if that seems appropriate, and of course the fingertips if they're showing. I may struggle to do the fingertips on this hand, because they're actually on the inside of the gun, right close to the body. So if I can reach them, I'll highlight them. If I can't, well, it's hardly going to show later, so I'm not too worried. I've just noticed I've made a mistake. I've actually got flesh coloured paint on the handle of the stick bomb, so I'm very quickly getting some water on it with the brush, cleaning the brush, getting some water on it, spreading the paint out so it doesn't leave a stain, and then wicking away the water and drying it on the brush. And there we go, we've saved the day. So now, once the brush is dry enough, we can stick it back in the paint and carry on painting the hand. With this hand, exactly the same as before, top edges, knuckles, joints, tops of the fingers, but also the actual fingertips themselves, because of course on this side they are all showing at the front as the hand's wrapped around the gun, and you can see each of the tips and then each of the joints needs painting and so on and so forth. I have kind of lined each finger as well, heading towards the front. I'm not quite sure if that's the right direction for the light to be going in, but it seemed right at the time. I'm just having to tip the handle upside down just so that I can actually see what I'm doing and reach all of these fingers and knuckle joints. Now that's done, moving on to the gang leader. So exactly the same stage as before, so this has two highlights in tanned flesh, and now we're doing the lighter Barbarian Flesh. Although it's not a particularly light colour, it is the lightest colour we've used on the flesh on this model so far, and so this will be most likely the final highlight. And again, we're just going in on the top of the head where it meets this sort of metal mohawk section, and then focusing in on the very peaks of things like the very outer edges of the eyebrows, the very tip of the nose, tops of the ears, etc. Now, as this guy is the gang leader, maybe the stress is getting to him or something, but he has a lot more fine lines on his face, and they are a little finer, and the wrinkles are a little deeper, so just take your time, be careful, catch all of the raised edges and take your time, because there's things like this cigar that's in the way that makes it awkward to get around, like the lines on the cheek and the lips and the chin and so on. Just take your time, because not only is the face a focal point of the model, this gang leader is a focal point of the gang. So this is one of them that you really don't want to take any shortcuts on. You really want to just take your time, do what you can do to get all of the lines painted properly, and as I say, if you make a mistake and you have to come back and correct something with one of the previous colours, there's no shame in doing so. You may realise from some of this footage, a lot of the time I spend with these models is actually looking to see what's been done and what hasn't. So if you see me flipping them around and not actually painting, it's just like, have I painted the face, have I painted the neck, just checking it out kind of thing. So we're moving on to the neck, just doing the tips. You can't really see the wrinkles on the back of the neck from one side, so you can only really highlight them on the kind of hammer side. And just doing the very, very tips there, and then moving on to the tops of the traps, and then the sort of lines sticking up around like the chest and so on. Once that area is done, we move on to painting very thin lines to highlight the muscles again. If in doubt, stick them at the upper edges, or in the case of the middle of the shoulder, which is uppermost on the model, probably in the middle. And just anywhere where you feel it would catch the light. Again, I'm aiming for thin lines, like striations you might see on a bodybuilder, but I realise as this model is barely over an inch tall, it's a bit unrealistic to expect you to have thin parallel lines on every single muscle. But even so, I'm still painting in those kind of directions just in case it starts to show that kind of pattern and starts to look a little more realistic. Not that there's anything particularly realistic about these guys. So this area around the gun arm has a lot of hard to reach areas, because not only has it got the gun, obviously he's got this great big shoulder pad as well, and it makes it difficult even with a fine tip brush like this just to get in and highlight anywhere that looks necessary. Now of course there isn't that much on the outside, but on the inside of the arm you can see quite a lot more detail that still needs highlighting. Perhaps not as much because it would be somewhat in shadow and not as exposed, but I'm still going to highlight it as best as I can. Moving on to the hands, again not only are these hands quite exposed, but there's also a tiny bit more detail, maybe because it's the gang leader, or maybe just because it's the plasma gun and he's really nervous. But just take your time to highlight each joint, top line of the fingers, fingertips if they're available, and that way you can see all of the highlights on the hand from dark to light. So same again with this hand, just picking out all of the finger joints, the top lines of the fingers. I'll flip it round and do the thumb area, and then he's pretty much done. Right, so this is a still picture of the gang leader as he was at the end of the previous video, with just one layer highlight of tanned flesh to give you some idea of where we started. And then here's the guy with the shotgun after 2 layers of the same paint. You can hopefully see around the face and shoulder, it's starting to look a little bit more highlighted. And then here's the same guy, but now with the 3rd colour, the lighter Barbarian Flesh as well, and I'm hoping particularly again around the face, shoulders, hands, etc. You can see what I've done. Right, if you stuck with it this far, firstly thank you for watching. If you did actually like the video, hit like, hit subscribe, hit the little bell shaped icon so you get notifications telling you when the next video will be out. I hope that will be soon. Thank you for watching.